Hi guys, I am here again making a recorded version of the lecture. So hopefully this will be much like it was in class. I'll talk about the same things. Maybe you'll hear additional things. Maybe I will not say some of the things that I said in class. So let's dig in. We're going to talk about aeromedical factors. Remember we talked about human factors as a whole, which is kind of the study of how humans interact with one another and process information and make decisions due to our human limitations, right? We have to have a special type of study to correlate those results with accidents and things like that so we know how to prevent them. So when we talk about human limitations, one of the major things that we run against ourselves to make sure that we are performing at our best, which is again not as repetitive and successful as a machine, but we run this I'm safe checklist against ourselves. So that consists of illness, medication, stress, alcohol, fatigue, eating, and emotions. I'm safe is a really good way to remember the items of the checklist. It's really formalized. But when we think about these things, our body kind of tells us what's out of order right away, right? Or if everything's fine, there's nothing that sticks out for us. So just remember this checklist as a reference. Illness and medication are pretty straightforward. Stress, remember we have that new dichotomy. We have acute stress, which is like day-to-day stress. So if I give you a test and you're worried you're not going to pass, then that's acute stress, right? A one-time deal that comes and goes. However, chronic is a continuous stressor, right? Something that reoccurs and never stops. So financial problems, relationships, those sorts of things, they can leave a negative lasting impact. Same thing for fatigue, right? We categorize that as acute and chronic. So if you're experiencing chronic anything, whether that be stress or fatigue, you might want to get some help. Alcohol, we will talk about the regulation that pertains to that, but just know that we should not be flying with alcohol in our system because it is illegal. And then eat as best you can. I think I said in class that this is something that I have not really been that great at. So try to do better than me. Eat all 3 meals, maybe have small snacks between meals to make sure that you are keeping your body going, right? It needs fuel to do what it does, especially piloting. I know that that gets rough. And then if there's something that throws your emotions out of whack, then you should maybe reconsider flying. So I'm safe checklist is something you should run against yourself every time you are preparing to fly. Now we're moving into more physiological things such as oxygen consumption, right? Intake and consumption. So when we don't have enough oxygen, that is what we call hypoxia, right? A lack of oxygen in the body. And if we think about the overall intake process and utilization process of oxygen through the body, then we can categorize those 4 different types of hypoxia and match them with a stage in the process. So again, those 4 steps. The first is we have to breathe in the oxygen. If we don't do that, we won't have any oxygen to do anything else with. So breathe in the oxygen. Number 2, oxygen must attach to the blood cells. If it does not bind to the blood cells, it cannot be carried, right? Which is step number 3. That blood needs to move through your body to distribute the oxygen to all of the cells, right? So they can run the Krebs cycle or whatever it is, produce 34 ATP plus 2 or whatever it was from high school science that I don't quite remember. But the last step in the process is that the cell has to be able to actually use the oxygen. So one more time, oxygen intake. We breathe in the oxygen attaches to our blood cells, the blood cells move the oxygen to the cells use the oxygen. So the types of hypoxia that link to those different steps in the process are hypoxic, hypemic, stagnant, and histotoxic. If we are experiencing any of these types of hypoxia, we will know in a multitude of ways. Sometimes a particular symptom kind of shows up first for some people. Other times it's a mixture or a conglomeration of a lot of them. But some of the popular symptoms include cyanosis. So your extremities, like your fingertips, will turn blue when they do not have enough oxygen. So that's a really easy visual way to see that you don't have enough. My guess is that's probably not going to be the first indication. You'll probably feel tingly before then. You will maybe have some tunnel vision or lightheadedness, a little bit of a headache, something like that. But you could also end up experiencing euphoria, like everything is just laughable. In your free time, I would strongly recommend looking up people in a hyperbaric chamber, and that's a place where they basically decrease the amount of oxygen in the air or the concentration of oxygen so that people can experience these symptoms. If you know what your symptoms or your first symptoms are, you have a better chance of reacting quickly, right? When you're flying at high altitudes, aircraft are required to have oxygen systems in them, and there's a mask you need to put on called the quick donning mask. And if you don't put that on in about the first 12 or so seconds of oxygen deprivation, then you will likely pass out. There was a flight that happened not too long ago, a few years ago, but I believe the same scenario has happened multiple times. The pilots had a depressurization that occurred, and before they put on their oxygen masks, they looked at the checklist, and the first checklist item said something about one of the systems. So they were too busy checking something else. And by the time those 12 seconds had gone by, their brain no longer had the required oxygen for alert, attentive motions and tasks. So they passed out, and the aircraft remained on autopilot until it ran out of fuel and crashed into a field. I believe a crash of that same nature killed a popular golfer back in the 90s, but I could be wrong. But there's something like that not that long ago. This airplane on autopilot flew over the CIFRA, and I think maybe through the CIFRA, it got intercepted, and that's when the fighter jet pilots realized that the pilots inside were completely passed out and incapacitated, and there was nothing else they could do. So be careful, be able to recognize those symptoms, and I believe that's part of your training when you go to the airlines. You have to have some oxygen or hypoxia training. So you can experience any of those symptoms, but let's kind of walk through those different types of hypoxia. So we talked about the process. So step number one, being able to breathe that oxygen in. If you can't breathe it in, you are experiencing hypoxic hypoxia. Causes of this range from simple things like drowning, maybe having a plastic bag over your head, and that's why they say don't put plastic bags on your head, to just not having enough of that pressure differential to bring in that oxygen and expel that carbon dioxide. So if the pressure is too low, so if there's a depressurization at a high altitude, there will not be enough of that pressure differential to breathe in that oxygen, causing you to pass out. So that is hypoxic hypoxia. If you can't breathe in the oxygen, that is the type of hypoxia you are experiencing. If that is not the problem, then stage number two in the oxygen intake and usage process is the attachment to those blood cells. If the oxygen has a tough time attaching to the blood cells, or there's just not enough blood cells to carry the oxygen, then that is what we call hypemic hypoxia. Causes of this can range from anything like having a major cut or something, or maybe losing a limb in an accident or something and you're bleeding out. So if you don't have that blood in your body to transport the oxygen, then you're going to have a hard time getting that to the rest of the cells. So that's why people oftentimes pass out after they've lost a decent amount of blood, right? It's because they're struggling to get that oxygen in and have it attached to the remaining blood cells and be efficiently transported to the rest of the cells that need it. So that's a cause. You could donate blood, which is a very intentional way of decreasing the number of red blood cells available. You could also have carbon monoxide poisoning. Carbon monoxide comes from the exhaust gas. When we turn on the cabin heat in our airplanes, and I guess also in our cars, the exhaust gas that's hot from the cylinders and the engine is what heats that air. So we have clean air from outside that comes in that's heated by the exhaust gas. There is no direct or not there's not supposed to be any direct contact of those two different types of air. There is a shroud over that exhaust pipe that makes sure that the clean air stays clean and the exhaust continues to go in the direction it needs to go. When there is a crack in that shroud, exhaust can sneak in with that clean air, so the carbon monoxide can come in, and most times you will not be able to smell it. The first indication that you are experiencing this for a lot of people is that they start to feel really tired. There's one recording I know I've heard. It's like ATC audio of a pilot communicating with ATC, and you can tell that they sound like either they're experiencing carbon monoxide poisoning or they stayed up super, super late the hour before or the night before and shouldn't have been flying. So you will feel really tired. And the sneaky thing about carbon monoxide is that it's odorless for one, but also it takes a huge amount of time for the carbon monoxide to detach from the blood cell. Carbon monoxide is 200 times more likely to bind to the blood cell because it binds to the same active site than the oxygen. So once you have the carbon monoxide bound to that same active site, then that blood cell can no longer accept any oxygen. So if that happens to a great number of your blood cells, you're out of luck. So people take anywhere from, depending on how bad the carbon monoxide poisoning is, if they can get down, it takes anywhere from 24 to like 72 hours for that carbon monoxide to completely leave your system. So carbon monoxide poisoning is no joke. It's not like you can just turn off the cabin heat and open the cabin windows to expel the carbon monoxide and you'll be fine. No, that's not the end of it. You still have to get that airplane down so that you can rest and allow that carbon monoxide the time to detach. So that is I would say, probably the most um, low key and underrated type of hypemic hypoxia. So be on guard for that. I know we have carbon monoxide detectors in our airplanes. So if you look at the dash display, right, where all the instruments are, there should be a little plastic card with a little bit of felt circle inside. That's I think usually orange in color. And if that changes colors, if it gets dark, then that is a good indicator that there is carbon monoxide present. So yes, go ahead and turn off that cabin heat, maybe open a window, but try to get yourself landed as soon as possible. Because yes, that decreases the amount of carbon monoxide that's continually being absorbed by your blood, but also it just won't disappear, right? It's if it's in your system and it's attached to the blood cells, it is already there. Next in the process is, remember, the movement of those blood cells after the oxygen has bound to them. So if those blood cells can't move because of poor circulation or bad health, or you are maneuvering and you're pulling a lot of G's, so a lot of forces and things, then you will likely suffer from stagnant hypoxia. So when you look at those videos of these newscasters and other civilians going flying with military pilots, and the military pilot does something that pulls 5 or 6 or 7 Gs, that is exactly why the person passes out, because they are not making enough of an effort to move that blood. Right? You really have to tense up your muscles and control your breathing and keep that going to keep that blood flow moving. Otherwise, it stops essentially and you pass out. So make sure that you are not pulling crazy G's, right? Number one, our airplanes can't really handle that. And then number two, it would not be good if you passed out. So make sure that you're being kind to the airplane and try to not experience stagnant hypoxia. The last type, again, correlates with the last step in the process. So histotoxic hypoxia just means that, yes, the oxygen did enter the body, right? It attached to the blood cells. It was transported by the blood cells, which can freely move, and it reached the cell. The only thing inhibiting the completion of the process is the fact that the cell is poisoned to the point where it just can't really figure out what to do with that oxygen. Can't really use it to do what it needs to do to create more energy or whatever the Krebs cycle or the ATP cycle is. Okay. So when we have drinks, even just social drinking, that alcohol that goes in our system poisons our cells, right? Not just the liver. The liver is kind of it kind of works as the detoxing facility of the body, right? But alcohol spreads to all cells. If somebody has been drinking a great deal and they are sweating because they're doing stuff, more times than not, you can smell that they've been drinking, right? They don't have to breathe or say anything or do anything. Sometimes you can just smell them like, wow, they should maybe call it a night, go home, right? Get a cab, get an Uber or something because they've been hitting it heavy, right? So When we do stuff like that, we poison the cells and they can't use the oxygen for their benefit. So that makes it that much harder for the body as a whole to regulate itself, right? To create energy, to do all of these necessary things. When we think about what increasing altitude does to our body, right? Because there's less oxygen up there. Not the percentage of oxygen does not change, but the concentration does change because there are just less air molecules altogether as we ascend in the atmosphere. So essentially, anytime you consume alcohol or drugs, you're poisoning your cells to the point where they can't efficiently use that oxygen or at all, which is really not good. Think about that in terms of altitude. For instance, about an ounce of alcohol is the equivalent of a climb of about 2,000 feet. So if you're drinking a lot, if you've had a few 12-ounce beers, it's going to feel like you're pretty high up in the atmosphere. You're going to basically have the same amount of oxygen exposure, not because you're having trouble actually breathing the oxygen in, not because you're having trouble with your blood cells accepting the oxygen, not because you're having trouble with your blood cells moving the oxygen, but because you've poisoned those cells to the point where they don't know what to do. So please be careful, follow the regulations, okay? So, all of this, how can we prevent this? Well, we can make good decisions, as I said before. Don't have too much to drink. Do not even think about flying anytime after you've had something to drink. A sufficient amount of time needs to pass so that your system is clean. Okay, and if I had to guess, most of you in my class probably just shouldn't be having alcohol yet anyway. That's another matter. Regulations are our friends sometimes. So 91211 is a regulation about oxygen requirements. So the term that 91211 consistently uses is cabin pressure altitude. So not just altitude, but cabin pressure. And the real difference here is only if that airplane is pressurized. So our airplanes here at SIU are not pressurized. I don't know if the 340, which is like our executive multi-engine airplane, is pressurized or not. I don't think it is. But none of the other airplanes are pressurized, okay? So all of the altitudes here that are listed as pressure altitudes are equivalent to the actual altitude. So if we wanted to go to a cabin pressure altitude of 12,500 in our Cessna 172s, it would read as 12,500 on the altimeter. So those are all the same. So what this regulation says is that you need supplemental oxygen in certain conditions. So if you are above 12,500 all the way up to 14,000, you need to have supplemental oxygen that should be or has to be provided to the required crew if you spend more than 30 minutes there. So who is part of the required crew? If you are PIC, you are part of that. If the particular aircraft requires two pilots, then both of you are part of that. And if the particular aircraft in question requires a flight attendant or some other crew, maybe flight engineer back in the day, those would be the people that this would apply to. So regulations are kind of vague in a way. We're starting to learn about that now, but think about a way you could cheat the system. I'm not advocating for this, right? But this says that you must spend more than 30 minutes at that altitude block to have to use the supplemental oxygen. So theoretically, you could spend 29 minutes, 30 minutes up there, and then as soon as it hits 30:59, you could descend down to 12,499 and not have to follow the reg. But then the question remains, can you climb back up? Does that restart your timer over again? Or does that continue your 30 minutes up there? So I don't know. But that's kind of a funny thing with regulations is sometimes you can kind of see loopholes or people have different interpretations of the regs. Okay, but that's beside the point. So 12,500 up to 14,000, the required crew has to have the supplemental oxygen. Above 14,000 up to 15,000, they have to use that oxygen the whole entire time. So there's no 30 minutes here. If you are in that block of altitude, you must use it the entire time. Then above 15,000, the oxygen needs to be or has to be required to everyone, or I'm sorry, has to be supplied to everyone. But there's nothing that says that the occupants have to use it. So, like the passengers, the non essential people that are on board, I hate saying that, right? Because in the aviation industry, passengers are essential. If we don't have passengers, then what's the point of having airlines? But for the purpose of this regulation, the passengers don't really have to use it. There's nothing that says they have to use it. We just have to supply it. Okay. Now, this oxygen question that we need to bring with us is not just like regular oxygen you would find in a hospital, right? You can't stop by Carbondale Memorial on the way to the hospital and be like, yeah, let me pick up some of this oxygen. No, the oxygen in question is what we call aviators breathing oxygen, or ABO. And the difference between ABO and other types of oxygen is the content. So ABO is 99, at least 99.5% pure oxygen. We don't want anything else. We don't want any inert gases or anything like that. We need pure oxygen. And even more important, we don't want moisture inside that oxygen tank, because when we ascend in the atmosphere, remember the temperature decreases along with the pressure. And if our temp goes down and we have moisture in those lines that are coming from the tanks, then we run the risk of those lines freezing up. And then if they freeze up, we can't successfully breathe in that oxygen, right? And then we would be suffering from hypoxia. So that's really, really important. Reduced moisture content, 99.5% pure oxygen. The nice thing about ABO, which I didn't really know until, I don't know, a few years ago, is that it can come in all three forms, right? I guess if you're not counting plasma. But it can be like gaseous, like we're familiar with. It can be a liquid, or it can even be a solid. So if you want to bring a lot of oxygen with you, you can actually like drop the temperature on the oxygen, change it to a solid so that the volume of the oxygen container stays the same, but the density of the oxygen changes, right? So you can pack more oxygen in that same space compared to gaseous. So oxygen is really, really nice to have, right? But the other thing that's really nice to have that we don't really think about that much is carbon dioxide. Everything has to have a balance, right? That is the definition pretty much of an environment. Environment, there's not just one thing that exists that's a good thing. There has to be other things that are sometimes not so good that exist to balance whatever that good thing is. Right? Ever hear people say that too much of a good thing is a bad thing sometimes? Well, same sort of concept here. So if you don't have enough carbon dioxide in your system to balance out the oxygen that's already there, you will enter a state of rapid breathing, uncontrolled rapid breathing, which is called hyperventilation, right? So when something scares you, or I don't know, you're in a stressful situation, something like that, your carbon dioxide output is going to increase to a rate greater than it should naturally be. When that happens, right, we don't have enough carbon dioxide in our system to balance the oxygen. So we have to find a way to trap the carbon dioxide to keep it in our system so we don't lose all of it. And then also we have to find a way to regulate our breathing so that we don't keep expelling it at an expeditious rate. So a paper bag is a really great way to keep that carbon monoxide in. Even like an air sickness bag like we have in our airplanes are a really great thing to breathe into. Right, so that traps that carbon dioxide in there, so you breathe it back in, so you can regulate that that amount. And then while you're doing that, talk to yourself, right? Have a conversation with yourself about whatever, or you can sing, right? Any of these things are helpful at reducing your breathing rate so that you stop hyperventilating. So hyperventilation is really easy to see that that you're doing that. It might take a little bit to kind of adjust to that, I guess, and actually move towards stopping yourself from hyperventilating. But the symptoms that would also tell you that you're hyperventilating, if your brain doesn't want to believe it, are very much like those of hypoxia. So you might get tunnel vision, lightheadedness, that sort of stuff. Okay. Now, we've talked about oxygen, we've talked about carbon dioxide. Let's talk about nitrogen. right? Nitrogen comprises a large amount of our atmosphere. I believe like 78% of it is nitrogen, and it's an inert gas that's found pretty much everywhere. So nitrogen is chill most of the time. The only time it becomes a problem for us is when we are scuba diving. So when we go beneath the water, the pressure imposed on our bodies is greater than that of the atmosphere, right? So we don't have to descend that far under for it to feel like the ocean is like giving us a hug, right? Maybe too tight a hug. Maybe we don't want to be hugged that tightly. Um, but I have a lot of memories as a child diving in a 12-foot pool, and it was a really cool thing at the time to go down there and go get I think a 5 pound or 10 pound diving brick and swim up with it. But man, oh man, I would do that so often that my ears would hurt really badly. And that's just because of all that water pressure against your body, right? The vulnerable spots, especially your ears, are subjected to that the greatest. So, if we are to understand what happens to the nitrogen in the body when we descend, when we scuba dive below the surface of the water, we have to understand something called Boyle's Law. So, Boyle's Law is basically a relationship between pressure and volume. So, we know that if we, let's say, squeeze something, it gets smaller, right? The density of that object increases, but the physical area that it takes up gets smaller. So the same thing happens to the nitrogen bubbles in your blood. Think about a can of soda. When we have a can of soda that's sealed correctly and pressurized correctly, there are no bubbles that are visible, right? If you made that can clear, you would just see liquid inside. And the reason why is because all that pressure inside the can has dissolved that gas in the liquid, in the soda. So the same thing is happening in our bloodstream when we descend low enough. These nitrogen bubbles that are, again, just like everywhere, right? They are being pressurized and the volume is decreasing to the point where the nitrogen is dissolved in the bloodstream. So that's not really that important in and of itself. It's not going to cause you any pain. You're not really going to be able to feel that sensation. You're just going to feel a lot of pressure from being under the surface. The issue, however, comes into play when we ascend. So when we leave that lower depth, right, the scuba diving depth, and we go up, well, the pressure now decreases and the volume of those nitrogen bubbles increases. And if we are not careful, if we ascend too quickly, then those nitrogen bubbles will get bigger faster. And when that happens, they undissolve, I guess, or they go back to being a separate entity from the blood. And when you have all these bubbles and everything, they tend to group around your joints and things. And when they're expanding like that, they will start pushing on the walls of your blood vessels and capillaries and things, causing this really kind of uncomfortable, itchy feeling. And we call this the bends, right? Because it happens around the bends of your joints. So the insides of your arms, right near the elbow, you will experience that if you ascend too quickly, as well as the backs of your knees. Okay, so in and of itself, as long as you have a nice controlled ascent, it's really not a problem. However, to make matters worse, if you are flying after that, you have to be extra careful because the pressure decreases further the higher you climb in the atmosphere. So not only are you decreasing the pressure and increasing the volume of that nitrogen when you originally ascend up to the surface of that body of water that you were scuba diving in, but you further that if you are taking a commercial flight out of there. And that can be really, really, really painful. Okay, doesn't feel good. If it gets to be really bad, sometimes you can have your capillaries and some blood vessels like burst. Okay, but it's not a feeling that you really want to experience. So you should wait at least 12 hours after your scuba dive if you are flying at altitudes that are like less than 8,000. So if you're taking a little Cessna 172 back to wherever you came from or whatever, then 12 hours should be sufficient to allow for that pressure equalization to kind of happen, and that way, that the expansion of the nitrogen bubbles is not as prominent, right? It's not happening as quickly. However, if you're going above that, you should double that, right? So make that 24 hours if you're going above 8,000, or if you are diving to a depth that requires a controlled ascent. So a controlled ascent is basically where you ascend only, I don't know, 50 feet at a time or 20 feet at a time, allow your body some time to acclimate to that reduction in pressure, and then another 20 or 50 feet. I don't know what the unit is. Okay, but it's a incremental ascension so that your body has time to acclimate. Okay, so that's my 2 cents on that. You don't want to deal with decompression sickness. I've never had to deal with this, thankfully, but I'm sure you could find some stories of people who have, and it's just not fun. If you ever get the bends, you will never want the bends again. You wouldn't wish the bends on your worst enemy. Another thing is the middle ear blockages. So as I talked about, right, when you dive and you subject your body and your ear to a greater amount of pressure than you are used to, the eardrum is a very sensitive part of the body that is subjected to this pressure change. So even when we are flying and we've got some illnesses like congestion affecting us, we have to be super careful about how we treat our ears. So remember, as altitude increases, right, the pressure goes down, and then we have that expansion of the gas, right, according to Boyle's law. So if we have some congestion and everything, and I guess I should take a moment to go over the ear, right? So on the left there, you can see we've got that ear canal that goes to the outside of the ear, right? We've got the tympanic membrane, which is our eardrum, and then we've got that eustachian tube that goes down to your throat, right? Your ears and throat. So all of that is connected, right? That's why when you're not having a rocking time like that, or you're having problems with your sinuses, you go to an ENT, right? Ear, nose, throat doctor. All of that is connected. It's one package deal. So if you have some congestion and it's hard to kind of regulate that pressure, it doesn't feel that great when you're on the ground. But when you start to climb, think about what happens, right? Because we have a decrease in pressure, the air trapped inside your ear, right? So in the inner ear going down to the eustachian tube expands, right? And so does the air outside, but remember that's open to the outside, so that side can kind of equalize with what's going on out there, okay? But the stuff inside the ear on the inner portion is like trapped in there, right? So that increases in volume due to Boyle's law, right? Decrease in pressure equals increase in volume. So you're going to have your bulging eardrums like they're going out. Okay, so they're bulging outward. Now, for us, that's no problem because we can simply open our eustachian tube and open our mouth and everything and basically equalize that pressure. So we're just going to decrease the overall pressure of that air inside, right? So low pressure outside, high pressure inside. So we decrease the pressure on the inside, right? And that equalization happens and it doesn't feel so bad once you get up to altitude. So that's not the problem, right? But when we descend, you have, again, decreased the pressure on the inside of the ear. Well, what happens to that pressure on the outside of the ear when we're coming down? We're getting closer to the Earth's surface, so the pressure is going to increase, right? The weight of all those air molecules is going to increase. Okay, so there's a high pressure now on the outside of your ear and a low pressure on the inside, which means that your eardrum is going to be bulging in which direction? In, right? In towards your inner ear. And that is really, really not comfortable. It feels like an elephant is like literally stepping on your eardrum, right? That the toughest like steppers are like having a party, right? They're stomping on your ears, okay? So this equalization is a little bit harder because now we have to encourage air to enter through our nose or mouth or whatever to go into the eustachian tube to provide a pressure that is equivalent to that of the outside of the ear, right? So we're trying to increase the pressure to make that equalization happen. Sometimes this is almost impossible if you have congestion happening, right? You don't have all of your pathways clear and open, so it's just hard to get that high pressure inside to equal out the high pressure on the outside. I had a student once who told me that his vision went completely white because the pain was so bad as he was descending. And he just had a stuffed up nose. I don't think it was even a full cold yet. So be extra careful when you're making that decision to fly or not. Make sure that you are really feeling up to it. Okay, because luckily for him that day, his instructor at the time was next to him and was able to take the controls. But if you are out on a solo or solo cross country and you have this problem, there's not going to be anybody there to help you out. Okay, and that could really end poorly. So please be careful with even just minor cold like symptoms. They're not fun to be dealing with. So it seems like all we've talked about so far is like limitations to systems, but let's talk about some systems overall, right? So the visual system, the eye is really cool. It's like a camera, high definition camera. So you've got different parts of the eye. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but the two I really want to focus on are the rods and the cones. So the cones are there for like light perception and color perception, more importantly. So I'm looking outside my window right now, and I've got some really, really beautiful yellow, I think, daffodils on the side of my house here. And my cones are which part of my eye is delivering me that image. Right? It's able to detect the wavelengths that the flower is giving off, so I can see what color it is, and it also helps with the clarity of the picture. So right now it's still light out. It is starting to kind of get dark. If I look to the west, the sun is setting. And once that is set, I will have a much harder time seeing the awesome, like bright, kind of muted pastel yellow of those daffodils because my cones can no longer perform efficiently without sufficient light. It is now up to my rods to basically take over. So rods are a little bit more motion and light sensitive when it's dark. So that's all they pick up, and they kind of sit around the peripheral edge of your focal point, or like the outside of your eyes a little bit there. So sometimes, in order to have really good night vision or acceptable night vision, because night vision is never like super great, you can't look at things dead on, right? If you're looking at things dead on, you're trying to use your cones to get that picture for you. But at night, remember, they don't work so great. So sometimes looking at things kind of off out of the corner of your eye or using your peripheral vision can help you get a better idea of what something looks like. So when I'm flying and scanning for traffic and things, I went on a night cross country not that long ago, and I feel like that was the most traffic I had ever seen. None of it was close to us by any means, but I saw a lot of traffic. What I was doing was I was using my peripheral vision, and I was kind of slowly scanning, okay, kind of in a pattern. So I would go back and forth and work my way from the top of the windshield down to the bottom to make sure that I was giving my eyes time to adjust and to see everything that I could possibly see. So the visual system is nice, but it's limited in that way. Sometimes when we are flying at night, our eyes have a really tough time seeing things, and part of that is because we are up in the air where there's less oxygen, and because the eyes are working so hard to get you that picture, they actually use more oxygen than during the daytime. Okay, so we take measures that we'll talk about later to kind of prevent hypoxia. Excuse me. Optical illusions. Some of the limitations our eyes have is that things don't always look like exactly what they're supposed to be. This image here, if you spend enough time looking at it, it will start moving. It's moving for me right now. Maybe that's because I spent a long time working on my grad homework last night. I stayed up till like 11:50. Um, but maybe it's just because my eyes aren't that good, right? So the width of the runway is a really popular illusion that confuses pilots a lot of the time. So think about it. If you are really high over a runway, is it going to look like it's smaller or larger than it actually is? Probably smaller, right? The farther away from something you are, the smaller it looks. Okay, so that makes sense, right? That gives us some depth perception. as to our current location in reference to that object. So that's all well and good until we have runways that are of different widths. So if I have 36 right, so the big runway at our airport, if I have that runway in mind, I know that it's a little bit wider than some of the other runways that we might deal with. So keep in mind that when it's wider, it looks like we're lower than we actually are, right? Because wider makes it look like we're closer, so our depth perception can't really comprehend that sometimes. So wider means it looks like we're closer. And then if we are landing on a smaller runway, you might actually think you're higher than you really are. I've had some students and some check rides go out to Pinckneyville to do landings, and they have a pretty skinny runway up there. It's even smaller than 36 left, 18 right. And I've had some people be surprised when their mains touch down. Like, whoa, I thought we were higher than we actually were. So it's something that affects us quite a bit. Right, you can have slope illusions as well. So if you have a runway that kind of slopes up or down, that can lead you to think different things. If you go on a solo cross country or dual cross country to Dyersburg, Tennessee, their runway that they have available slopes downward, or I guess upward, depending on which way you land. But generally speaking, all the times I've gone there, I've used the runway that's, I think, more south facing, and there's definitely a definitive downhill I guess, slope to it. So just be aware of these things, right? If there's water, sometimes that can affect your vision as well. So we've got the visual system. We've also got the somatosensory system, which is basically your nervous system. It's just another name for that. So everything comes down from your brain, right? You've got the spinal cord, which is like the root of the system, and then you've got all of the fine nerve endings that go to your extremities. When we use our somatosensory system to figure out our orientation and attitude when we're flying, this is something called flying by the seat of your pants. And sometimes it works, right? When you have a really nice VMC day, so no clouds or anything like that, you can do a pretty good job of using your nervous system to figure out the sensations and everything and which way you're oriented. If you're in a turn, are you descending? Are you climbing? Those sorts of things. But by itself, it's not really a reliable system. So it counts on the visual system, and it also counts on the vestibular system. This system, again, is kind of weak on its own, but it's a cool system by design. So if you look at the diagram there, right, we've got the airplane that can move in all three planes of rotation. So we've got the yawing motion, right? So that's when we move around so the stick that extends from the roof to the floor of the airplane there is what we call the vertical axis. So if we rotate that around, then that's our yawing motion. The stick that goes from the nose to the tail, that's what we call our longitudinal axis. And if we rotate that like a skewer or a spit, right, on a fire, like we're roasting something, then that causes us to roll in either direction. Okay, and then if we take the stick that goes from the left wingtip to the right wingtip and we turn that around and rotate that, then that gives us a pitching motion. So we have three axes of rotation. The semicircular canals in our ear that are part of the vestibular system are designed in the same way. So we've got one in each plane of motion, and inside each of these semicircular canals, there is fluid, and then there's hairs that like line the walls. So when you move in a certain direction or any direction, that fluid moves and influences the hairs to the point where they send a signal to the brain saying, hey, we've changed our orientation. We are now oriented in this fashion. So that's a pretty cool system. It is obviously limited, right? Think about flying without your eyes or without really feeling what's going on via your nervous system, right? If you're just kind of relying on your vestibular system, or I'll take that up a notch, right? I'll raise my bet. Let's add the somatosensory system to that. So if we have the somatosensory system available along with the vestibular system, but we have our eyes closed, we have a really tough time figuring out what's what. Our brain lies to us all the time about how we are oriented. And this kind of goes to show, right, that each of these systems has their own limitations, right? Visual, we have different parts of the eyes that work better at different times than others, that uses an extreme amount of oxygen at some times, right? We have the somatosensory system, which just can't be used by itself unless we have the other systems kind of working in tandem with it. And then the vestibular system is just, again, not reliable by itself, right? But these are all good systems when they work together. So that chord right there is a major chord, right? It has a really nice sound to it. It's too bad I'm not by my piano, otherwise I would play it for you. That's an E major chord. That is the best key that there is in music. And I don't know, maybe ask me about that in class and I'll try to explain it. I wrote a whole paper on it in undergrad, but that's besides the point, right? So when all three of these systems are doing what they're supposed to do and they're working together in harmony, you have a nice sounding chord like this, right? But when one of them is out of the equation, usually the first to go is going to be that visual system, then things are kind of out of whack. You can experience motion sickness when you don't have good visual cues that go along with your other systems. For instance, you will feel that you are moving in the car, right? You can feel the vibrations of the car. You know what it feels like when it moves. So your somatosensory system gives you that. Your vestibular system is, again, oriented in a certain way. But if you are trying to look inside, read a book, and you're also seeing what's happening outside, then that just adds to the confusion. So you're looking inside at something that's like stationary, and then outside at something that's moving, and your brain is like, I don't know what's going on. I can't comprehend this. And that's when you start feeling sick or disoriented. So a popular scenario in which this might happen to us is if we should find ourselves in the clouds, right? In instrument meteorological conditions. So remember, the fix for this is always, first and foremost, maintain control of the airplane. And the only way that we can truly do this is if we trust our instruments. We have to, right? Because I just got done telling you that when that vision is taken away from you, and that's not to say you can't see anything, right? But all you see is white outside. There's no horizon to reference, nothing like that. So when you can't use your vision in the way that you are used to using it, then you have to ignore the feelings that the rest of your systems give you. Your somatosensory system is no good to you anymore. Your vestibular system is no good to you anymore either. You need to trust the instruments. If you're trying to maintain straight and level, which I hope you are in this scenario, you need to be looking at that attitude indicator. It needs to show that those wings are level. You need to look at that altimeter. It needs to show that you are not climbing or descending. You need to look at that VSI. It needs to show you 0 for climb or descent rate, right? And you can look at some of the other instruments to kind of cross-check that, right? Cross-checking is something you'll learn about an instrument, but it's really important, okay? So trust those instruments. Once you have done that, start working on turning yourself around. You should turn around 180 degrees because if there was a time where you were not in the clouds, then that is the direction that that area is in. So if you got into the clouds, you can get out of the clouds. So when you are figuring out how to turn yourself around, look at the heading indicator and note what your heading is. Figure out what 180 degrees from that is and plan for that. I would say if you are sitting in the left seat, plan on making that turn to the left. And when we make this turn, we're not going to add a ton of bank. We're going to bank ourselves to something called the standard rate of turn. So standard rate of turn is generally speaking around 15-ish degrees of bank when we're doing about 100 knots. Okay, whatever your true airspeed is, take 15% of that, and that will get you your angle of bank required for standard rate. Standard rate is 3 degrees per second. So if you were turning around 180 degrees, if we divide that by 3, right, 3 degrees per second, we should end up with 60 seconds or 1 minute that turn should take us. So as we're rolling in, right, we want to make sure by looking at our turn coordinator that we are in fact performing that standard rate turn. Our turn coordinator will also show us whether we need more rudder or not, so keep yourself coordinated and add a little bit of back pressure, right? Go back to that altimeter and attitude indicator to make sure that you are not losing that altitude. If you're parked at 3,000 and you have to add a little bit of back pressure to maintain the 3,000, look at what stops that altimeter. So add the back pressure until it stops, and then look at that attitude indicator to see how much pitch you had to add or back pressure. All right, that's a great way to instrument fly is to correlate the information on those instruments. I'm looking to maintain this condition on this instrument or according to this instrument, and now I'm going to translate that information to another instrument to make sure that I will always be maintaining that condition. So look at that attitude, make sure that you're pitched appropriately to maintain that altitude. You might have to add just a touch of power if you don't want to slow down. But at this point, I would rather your focus be on maintaining that coordination and that standard rate turn. So turn yourself around to the 180-degree heading and then use those instruments in the same fashion to get yourself out of that turn, right? Roll yourself to straight and level, slowly and smoothly. And then use those instruments again. Go through them and make sure they are telling you exactly what you want to see. If they are not, then you need to fix it. Do not panic, but fix it immediately. That way you lessen the risk of entering an unusual attitude. So when you're rolling out, you should see that your bank angle is decreasing. So the little airplane and the turn coordinator should start going back to straight and level. The attitude indicator should show the little airplane going back to straight and level. Your altitude should not fluctuate. I just dropped my pen. Your altitude should be constant, so you should be letting out some of that back pressure theoretically. And you might also check on your airspeed and stuff like that as well, right? You might need to take a little bit of power out now that you're not turning. Okay. And you will not see immediate results, right? Because if we think about this thought process, it's likely taken us some time to process the situation. There's first the initial shock that we've gone into the clouds. And then there was figuring out how do I turn around, right? How do I do that without losing control? So don't panic if you don't immediately leave the clouds, but just keep maintaining control of that aircraft in the same manner, and you will eventually find your way out. Okay, so follow those steps if you are ever in that scenario. Do not descend, right? We don't know what's below us. Once we're in the clouds, you might be up there, and the last thing that was below you that you saw was farmland 2,000 feet below you. We have no way of absolutely knowing whether that farmland continues or we now have a rocky cliff out in front of us that extends up quite a ways. Okay, so do not descend, do not climb, because if you are in a cloud, that is visible moisture, and ascending now invites low temperature to the party, right? And if you have low temps, especially those at or below freezing, and visible moisture, you get icing. We don't want to deal with that. So just turn yourself around while maintaining the control in exactly the manner that I have described. Keep yourself calm, right? Always remember that your number one priority is to fly the airplane. I don't care if you are talking to center, if you have flight following. I don't care if you feel like you need to call somebody. You need to fly that airplane first, okay? Don't let that airplane fly you. Fly the airplane. Then once you've got your bearings, once you're out of the clouds, then you can worry about the other stuff, right? You can navigate if you've gotten lost or you need to find a place to land. You can now worry about that. And then if you need to ask somebody for help or something, now you can worry about that. But aviate, navigate, communicate. Always aviate first. Okay? Now, when we talk about trusting the instruments, that goes with the thought process that sometimes our vestibular system, especially, is going to be throwing us different feelings that don't quite match with what the instruments are telling us. Okay, but we always trust those instruments over our vestibular system. So here are some instances of vestibular illusions that we can be subject to if we're in a situation like that. The first is the leans. So when we're making that turn, right, to go back to that 180-degree heading, we are spending a minute in that turn at standard rate, right? So a minute is actually quite a decent amount of time to be in a turn, and something that can happen to us is the fluid in our ears moving, right, to trigger those hairs to send a message to our brain that we are entering the turn. So if we're starting the turn, we likely get the correct indication that we are turning in some sort of fashion. However, the problem comes once we're established in that turn. So if we are established and we're not changing our bank angle, any of that stuff, then that fluid is not going to be moving, right? and those hairs will not be sending another message or signal to the brain. So, what your body starts to think is that that turn that you're so well established in, that nice standard rate turn, nice coordinated turn, is straight and level. And when your body thinks that, if you try to alter that, it's going to think that you are entering another turn. So once you've held that standard rate turn in for 1 minute and we're back on that 180-degree heading in difference from our original heading, we're going to roll out, right? So when we start to roll out in that opposite direction, the body is not going to feel like we are returning to straight and level, but it is rather going to feel as if we are initiating a turn in the opposite direction. Okay, and this can be dangerous for many reasons, right? If we feel like we are initiating a turn in the opposite direction, then we have a tendency to roll ourselves back into that turn that we are established in. Okay, and then that opens up the door for graveyard spiral. That's like the next thing in that progression, in that thought process. So when we go back to that turn, remember I talked about adding a little bit of back pressure to keep that altitude on you when you're in a turn. Right, so what happens aerodynamically, if you haven't already learned at all about this, you will, right, in my class and with your instructor. But what happens in a turn is we lose out on the vertical component of lift, right? We're increasing the horizontal component of lift by increasing that bank angle in the direction of the turn. And when that happens, if we do nothing else to make up for that lost vertical component of lift, we will start to lose altitude. So that's why we have to add a little bit of back pressure, right? A little bit of tail down force to keep that nose up to make sure we don't lose that altitude, right? The other side of that is if we add some tail down force, we're increasing the angle of attack to increase that vertical lift, and now we're going to slow down. So that's why I wanted you to add some power before. But if we are going back into that turn that we were in, that nice standard rate coordinated level turn, and we now think that that's straight and level rather than a turn, are we going to add that back pressure? No, right? We're going to feel like this is straight and level and that we don't need that back pressure. So what will happen as a result is we will start to lose out on that altitude. And as we're descending, we'll wonder what's happening. Well, I thought I was in straight and level, right? Why am I descending? And if you look at your instruments, if you haven't been looking at them this whole time, you'll also ask yourself, why am I in a bank? And why is this bank increasing? Why am I beyond standard rate? I don't quite understand this. And while you're trying to process that, your airspeed is going to be increasing and increasing because you haven't changed that power setting at all during this descent. And you will eventually get to the point where your turn is going to tighten and you're going to realize, oh shoot, I'm descending, I need to add back pressure. So you're going to add the back pressure, and at that point, you will do one of two things. You will either add just enough to tighten up that turn and make it worse, or add too much to the point where your airplane breaks up into pieces because you have subjected it to too strong of a force of load factor. And in both of these instances, there is no good outcome, right? If it breaks up into pieces, you're screwed. And also, if you tighten up your turn, you're going to lose altitude faster, and you are eventually going to collide with the ground, right? Collision, I don't know, CFIT, right? Controlled flight into terrain. That's what I was trying to think of. But CFIT, right, is going to be the end result. So don't let this get you, okay? Be careful in the clouds. Make sure you are maintaining that altitude, and make sure that if you are feeling something else that says, hey, this is a turn, not straight and level, that you tell your body, right? I know you, vestibular system. You are unreliable. I'm going to trust my instruments. Okay, that's what you need to do in that scenario. A few others. We have Coriolis illusion. So when you move your head outside the plane of motion, right? So if I'm banked at 45 degrees in a, let's say, a steep turn, and I'm doing more than moving my head from side to side, I'm moving it up and down and all around, I'm moving it outside that plane of motion. When I do that, that scrambles that fluid in your semicircular canals and sends a million different messages to your brain about your orientation, right? It feels like your head is like swimming or spinning. Okay, and that does not feel so great. Let me tell you about that. But you get used to it. Okay, So Coriolis is something to be concerned about, just to kind of avoid and ignore if you really have to. Somatographic is hard for us because we don't have super great acceleration most of the time. But if we had really fast acceleration, right, if we jammed a bunch of power in there, we might feel like we are in a nose high attitude, and then we would basically feel like we were like falling backwards, right? So our response to this would be to push the nose down, and in some instances, that's really not a good thing to do, right? Because depending on your ground proximity, that could be really, really bad, right? Think about it. A go around is a really good example of this. If you are slow on approach, so you're doing like your 65 knots that you're supposed to do, and something happens to the point where you feel like you have to go around and you add a bunch of power in, if it feels like you are pitched up high and you push forward as a reaction, then you run the risk of CFIT, right? Because you're close to the ground likely at that point, and you run the risk of smashing yourself into the ground. So be careful there. Add the power quickly and promptly, but also smoothly, right? Don't just jam the power in. Not good for the airplane and not good for us. Inversion illusion is kind of the opposite. So let's say you just finished your takeoff, right? You're on initial climb out, and you're headed in the direction of your favorite practice area. You're running checklists, you're talking to your instructor about what you're going to do out there today. Um, you look at your instruments again and you see that you've reached your desired altitude, and you go, oh shoot, and you push forward the nose, right? You push it down in an effort to maintain that altitude you said you would climb to. Well, you might have this feeling that you were tumbling backwards, right? And if you feel like you're falling backwards, that also implies a nose high attitude, or that's what it feels like to you. So you will again push too far, right? To the point where you're not going to maintain your altitude, but you will descend. Okay. And then inversion, I'm sorry, elevator illusion is just when you have a kind of a bumpy day, right? Warm, bumpy day where you have updrafts or thermals or things pushing you around and everything. It's going to feel like you're climbing, or like you have a nose high pitch attitude. So you might push the nose down in those scenarios. And some people push too far. Okay, so those are your vestibular illusions to be concerned about. Right, the first two are like really, really grave, but these are a little, I guess, more benign. Still, they can be dangerous though, so be careful. Last thing I have to leave you with is nighttime considerations. We already talked about the visual system's limitations to a point, but when we are flying at night, we have to be nice to our eyes and especially our rods. So, for our eyes to do the best they can, we need to adjust ourselves to the darkness as soon as we can. So generally, when you guys have night flights, you'll show up about an hour, 15 minutes before end of civil twilight, and that's a good time to pre-flight and get everything ready to go. You should spend the time after that, once it starts to get dark, um, like acclimating your eyes to the darkness. So don't look at any bright lights or super bright screens. Try to keep everything dimmed on low. I know it's not really that easy, given how bright the lights are upstairs when you go to like meet with your instructor and talk about your night flight and stuff. But try your best to do that. Use red light once it gets dark to keep your eyes adjusted. Right? Red light has the longest wavelengths and it's most akin to darkness. So you basically minimize your disruption of that adjustment that you spent time doing to your eyes. To do that, people have avionics jacked way up, but I swear in the G1000s, I've gone on night cross countries where I've turned the brightness of the screens down to like 0.5%. Because it just seems, as it gets darker and darker out, it seems like the displays keep getting brighter and brighter, so I just keep turning that down to keep my eyes adjusted. And it's really important because it makes it so much easier to see traffic and things at night. Even if you can see traffic at night, sometimes it's hard to figure out which direction that traffic is moving in and the altitude of the traffic. So you spend a lot of time trying to figure out what's going on out here? Where's that airplane? Which direction is it moving in? Is it coming towards me? Is it kind of at the same altitude as us? But if you've been looking at your bright avionics for the past, I don't know, few seconds, and you go back out to that dark scene, it's going to be harder for you to detect that traffic and avoid it. You guys remember how long that collision avoidance takes, right? So just things to consider.
If we are flying at night, we should also be nice to our eyes in the sense that we should choose a lower altitude. The lower we fly, the less likely we are to have hypoxia, right, or symptoms of hypoxia. And remember, those eyes, those rods especially, need a ton of oxygen at night to do their job like they should. So try to not fly at anything greater than 5,000 at night. And of course, this also begs the question, well, what's the correct altitude? Because we don't want to be too high or we don't want to be too low, right? That's not a good thing to be at night. I would say 3,500 works quite well at night. 4,500 works quite well at night, depending on which direction you are traveling in. Okay, so just try to be nice to yourself in that way. The nicer you are to your eyes, the less likely you are to be a victim of these nighttime illusions. So, false horizon is one that has happened to many people. This is where there's a string of lights, like kind of out in the distance, and they're not necessarily aligned with the horizon. They might be angled, right? They might be some cityscape lights, maybe even stars, things like that. But if you've got a line of lights out in front of you, the subconscious response of the brain is to basically just orient the airplane in a way that is parallel to or complements that line of lights. And this has gotten people into unusual attitudes, and that has not ended well for them. So be careful. Again, check your instruments to make sure that you are oriented in the correct way. At nighttime, because there's not as many visual references outside, your eyes should already be inside looking at those instruments a little bit more than the daytime, right? You still want to spend a lot of time scanning because traffic is, again, hard to see at night and hard to figure out, but have a little bit more trust in those instruments to keep yourself from falling victim to things like this. Autokinesis is another one. If you get bored on the cross country and you're just like staring outside because you've got the airplane perfectly trimmed out and you have a headwind, and it's going to be a long cross country and the seats are uncomfortable and you're trying to dissociate, well, don't, right? Because if you see a really bright star, like I think there's a star called like Sirius A or Sirius B, and it's a pretty bright star, right? So if I keep looking at that star and it's like appearing to twinkle and everything, I might think that that star eventually is moving if I look at it for too long. And once that happens, again, the subconscious response is to basically follow that star or aim ourselves at the star. So you can get yourself into trouble that way as well. The last is featureless terrain. If you're flying over an area that does not really have lighting, it's like a dark body of water at night, and there's nothing you can use outside pretty much for a reference. Number one, that is legally IMC. Um, that can be counted as IMC if you have no features out there to use. Luckily for us, our cross countries take us over well populated and well lit areas. But if you are out over the Atlantic Ocean, there's a high overcast layer, so no moon or anything, and you just have darkness out in front of you, right? No lights from the other side of the world or anything like that, then that would technically be IMC if you don't have a horizon to reference. But the danger with this, for anybody, instrument rated or not, is that we have a tendency to descend when this happens. We basically fly into the black hole. And if you are out over a body of water like that, then it's as hard as concrete if you hit it fast. Right? So some bad things have happened to people for that reason as well. So I hope this was a helpful summation, not really a summation because it's an hour and 10 minutes, and I apologize for that. But I hope this is a helpful lecture recording that you can draw on to kind of remind yourself of the limitations of the human body, right? The systems and how they work and how we cope as humans with those limitations. How do we stay safe? And how do we take care of ourselves? These are all super, super important questions to ask yourselves day in and day out because health is something that we can't just take for granted as pilots, right? When you move up to the airlines, most of them will want you to get a new first class medical either every 6 or 12 calendar months. And if you can't meet the requirements for that medical certificate, then you are out of a job. So please guard your health safely. Okay, make sure you're not flying on days where you should not fly, even if it means being behind in your course, even if it means your instructor gives you a little guff, and they shouldn't do that. But take care of yourselves. That's the biggest thing I have for you guys tonight.